So today we'll be talking about Microsoft Flow and how you can use it to automate business processes and approvals inside your organization. So by a show of hands, can I see how many people have heard of Microsoft Flow before? Okay, so almost everybody. That's awesome. How many people have built an approval flow before? Okay, so a much smaller percentage. That's relatively good since I'll be doing that in the demos today. So if you've already seen it, great, you can follow along. But if you haven't yet, then that's definitely one of the things I'll cover in the session today. So when we talk about Microsoft Flow, I'm going to give a little background on why we're making Microsoft Flow, who we see it for, and kind of what the purpose of Microsoft Flow is. And I like to show this graphic, and really what we're trying to say here is today there's data in a wide variety of systems inside and outside of your organization. There's email, there's files, there's messages, and the way that you integrate this data together today, more often than not, is by having people doing manual tasks. People have to go and they have to copy and paste data between systems. They have to make sure that when they get an email from their boss that they do the right thing, that if they're sending out an approval request that it goes to the right people. In fact, not only are people doing this, oftentimes people are doing this with pen and paper. A lot of the processes that are inside organizations today still have not been digitally transformed in a way that they can run inside the cloud. So with Microsoft Flow, we hope to make people be able to work less and do more, because we want people to work smarter inside organizations. And this applies not just to individuals, but also to teams and groups of people inside organizations. And they could do this with Microsoft Flow by automating the processes and automating the approvals and all of the things that go on inside of their organization. And what is Microsoft Flow? Microsoft Flow is a global scale software as a service that is intended to support the digital transformation of processes across many different verticals. We have data centers throughout the world. We run in Azure, just like you'd expect, and we are a complete, finished software as a service. That means you can go to flow.microsoft.com and sign up, and it just works out of the box. We are not like an infrastructure service. There's lots of great talks today and throughout the week at Build about infrastructure and how you can use Azure to build that. That's not what we are. We are a software as a service you can use to sign up today and start automating things inside your organization. So to set some context of how Microsoft Flow fits in with the other Microsoft business applications that we have, there are tailored applications that meet your needs no matter where you are. If you're managing people inside your organization, you're managing the products of your organization, managing the customers of your organization. And we have tools like Dynamics 365 that have built packaged applications that meet these needs. Plus, we have a wide variety of tools like LinkedIn, Bing, all across the board. All these applications build on top of a few key platform elements. So when we talk about the business application platform, I'm talking about the Power BI, Power Apps, and Flow. And together with Azure, they offer a platform for all of the business applications that Microsoft delivers. When you're thinking about digital transformation inside your organization, often the fastest and easiest way to get started is by purchasing an off-the-shelf finished application. Our Dynamics 365 applications like marketing, sales, service, talent, they are this. They're a complete application. But the fact of the matter is, many applications don't do exactly what you need. Every business has its own distinct requirements. So you need a platform that allows you to customize the processes of your organization. Oftentimes, there's no app for that because there's no business process that comes out of box. It just magically does what you need. So to represent it in a visual way, we have these packaged applications, but there's also all of these individual line of business processes that need to be created that span the distance between each of these individual applications. So if I want a business process that goes between marketing and talent, I need a way to do that, and the simple, out-of-the-box business processes that come with those individual applications won't do that for me. That's where Microsoft Flow, along with Power Apps and Power BI come in, is they allow you to fill in these gaps for the processes and capabilities of your organization. Moreover, we see that IT application development is becoming more focused on the high productivity and low code aspects of development. And what we mean by this is you shouldn't have to go and write a bunch of code just to accomplish a simple workflow. That wouldn't be a good use of your time, and it would be harder to maintain after you've done it. So we really think that the capabilities of the platform that we're delivering will make it much easier to build solutions, whether you're in IT or not. We think that these solutions will give you a way to build applications and solutions faster than you ever have before. And you can compose together things like analytics from Power BI, user interfaces from Power Apps, and the automation that exists inside Microsoft Flow. Together, we say these three things make up what we call the Power Platform. It's not an official term, but 2 of the 3 applications have the word power in them, so that's why we call it that. And the Power Platform targets power users. These are the people that are embedded inside the line of business that know what their business problem is most closely. Now, on top of this, we offer the developer platform capabilities of Azure. So Power BI, Flow, and Power Apps are built directly on top of equivalent Azure offerings for pro devs. So if you are a pro dev in the audience, which most of the people at Build probably are either developers or no developers themselves, that's where Azure comes in. And we really see the offerings that we have for power users being closely connected to the Azure offerings that we have. And both of these together, they use new capabilities in what we call the Common Data Service for Analytics and the Common Data Service for Apps that are the holistic data store for the data that your organization has and stores. So you can bring all of your business data and put in a single application or a single database that you can then build applications on top of, build processes, build your analytics on top of. We also have connectors and gateways, so that way, if you haven't brought your data into the Common Data Service, you can still connect to it wherever it is. Another way to think about this is how are we differentiating between the audience of developers and citizen developers is by the breadth of their offering. So today, there's a small set of applications that can be built using .NET and .NET and functions because it requires a lot of skill and capabilities to build those out. But if we start up-leveling these concepts, and we look at Azure Logic Apps, which I'll dive into a little bit more comparison later, but other technologies like Xamarin and Cordova, you're expanding the set of possible audience towards more of those citizen developers. And if you go all of the way to say, for Power Apps and Flow, we see there as being huge opportunity because really any citizen developer, and citizen developer is a little bit of a misnomer, it means somebody who isn't a pro developer, which means really they don't know how to write a lot of code. That is where we see Power Apps and Flow being really successful because as you'll see throughout the demos today, all it requires is thinking a little bit about your business problem to be able to bring together with UI drag and drop capabilities a business process in a way that works for your organization. So our key goal here is to democratize digital transformation inside of organizations, to make it possible for anybody building internal solutions and as a citizen developer to create things that their business needs. Now, that being said, we don't want there to be what we call cliffs, where I take a solution and I build it on one platform, and then suddenly I have to go rebuild it if I need it to be more advanced. So we've built the platform in such a way that I can take a very simple solution that I build, say, from a template, and you'll see, I'll walk through each of these steps in the demos today, but I'll start from a template, which is a very simple flow that just works out of box. And then you can grow up and say, hey, I'm going to customize this to my business's needs, but I'm still using the simple UI drag and drop capabilities that we have. And if even that is insufficient, and I need to be able to integrate with continuous integration, continuous deployment, and all the developer capabilities that I have, I can grow that up further and take that into a pro developer environment. So we've created this spectrum that you can always move along. You're not limited to just a very simple solution and then you have to throw everything away and start over with your powerful solution. So we think this is particularly powerful and unique to our platform inside Microsoft, unlike many of the other competitors out there. So I talked about the Common Data Service for Apps. What does that actually entail? The Common Data Service for Apps brings in data modeling, which means that you can create all of your business data, your business entities, the relationships, the attributes, and you can put that in a single place that your business can use. And the security model can live on top of that as well. Then there's the business logic. And this is where we see Microsoft Flow really fitting into the common data service for apps, because Microsoft Flow is a way to build business logic on top of your business's data. You can have it to do things like send notifications, to create actions, do whatever you need inside the data that your business has. And then there's the user interface, and I won't talk about that much today, but there are sessions that build about Power Apps, and I'd recommend checking that out if you're interested in how you can use our high productivity, low code platform to build UI. That's Power Apps, and you can use that to build both canvas-based and model-based applications on top of the common data service for apps. And one of the last things I want to mention on this slide that we hear a little bit of confusion about is what's the relationship between the common data service and Dynamics 365? And the answer is the common data service is the data platform that Dynamics 365 uses. So we've taken the data platform and made it so that way you can not only use it in your Dynamics 365 applications, but you can also use it to build customized business solutions with Microsoft Flow and with Power Apps as well as Power BI. But the fact of the matter is, today, most data does not live in the common data service. So we've built a robust series of connectors. We have over 200 connectors today, actually. This slide is a little out of date. That allows you to connect to SaaS cloud services, file providers, databases, web APIs, productivity solutions. Pretty much wherever you have data, there's a pretty good chance that there's a connector for that today. And this shows you just a snapshot of the connectors that we have available. Not only do we have connectors to SaaS services, we also have the ability to connect to on-premise data. If you have an organizational database that runs inside your local network, you can actually connect to that from Microsoft Flow. So you can use that to drive your business processes. You also can build custom connectors, which allow you to connect to custom endpoints that your organization may have created. And I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. Now, some organizations see this slide and they freak out a little bit because, hey, there's all these places that my company's data can end up going. How do I keep track of that? How do I prevent data from being leaked to places I don't want it to go? And the answer is Microsoft Flow comes with rich admin capabilities built in, so that way an organization can feel secure in using it in a way that does not result in data leaking outside of the organization. So we have things that we call data loss prevention policies, and these data loss prevention policies block data flow from a source that may be compliant to a source that's non-compliant. So this is how organizations can adopt Microsoft Flow and still be confident that data is not leaking in a way they don't expect. Now, Flow has, of course, a wide variety of standards. It has accessibility, and it also has extensibility, which means that developers who want to extend the capabilities of Microsoft Flow can as well. And there's those custom connectors I mentioned, as well as the ability to connect with Azure. And when I showed you that layered diagram with the Power Tier and the developer platform, really that's where I was talking about how Azure can be used to extend what you build for Power users inside your organizations. And one of the things that really excites me personally is Flow is embeddable via an SDK in your application. That means if you build a web application and you want workflows to be natively included in your application, you can actually do that simply by including the Flow SDK. And in doing so, as long as you support Azure Active Directory federated authentication, the user's flows can show up right inside your application. You can customize those views. So it's an awesome way to bring workflow capability directly into your app. Besides just giving IT control over what happens inside organizations, we also solve key problems for IT. Integration is a problem that spans the enterprise, and at the end of the day, there's only so many IT guys out there who can actually build solutions for the line of business. So we really believe that by democratizing the ability to create business processes, so that way any line of business can create the business processes that they need and automate them, it will make the job of IT much easier, because now they don't have to spend time building out bespoke solutions every single time that somebody requests a new process to be built. And this self-service capability enables the less technical users inside organizations to feel empowered, to feel like they can make a difference and they can make their own lives better. Sometimes, though, if there is a solution that has been built and you need to be able to, as IT, take it over, you can do that as well. And with Flow, we have built it directly on top of Logic Apps, which means if you've built a Flow as a business user and IT wants to take it, they can put it in IT's Azure subscription. Which kind of begs the question, what is the difference between Logic Apps and Flow? Well, the reality is there's far more commonalities than differences. Flow is built directly on Logic Apps. It is literally the exact same engine. It is the same UI designer. It's the same expression language. Performance characteristics are the same. Reliability is the same. It's the same thing at runtime, which means that Flow is just as robust as Logic Apps when it runs. But there is a key difference in that Logic Apps is our pro developer offering. It targets people who use Azure, who live in Visual Studio, who expect to use source control, who want continuous integration, continuous deployment, those types of things. That's where Azure really excels because it has things like Azure Resource Manager. It has things like the ability to go to the audit logs inside Azure, access via RBAC. All of these things are available inside of Azure. So if those are the types of things that you want for the workflows that you're building, Azure Logic Apps is the right solution for you. But the fact of the matter is, there's millions, well, I suppose there's technically billions of people in the world who don't use Azure today. And for those people, Flow, along with Power Apps and Power BI, are really a great option because they don't require having an Azure subscription. They don't require going to the Azure portal or installing Visual Studio or using any of those pro dev tools. They're a way for people to get started with just a few clicks. So why don't I dive into that? Building flows. So inside of flows, there are a few key concepts that I would like to talk about. All flows start with what's called the trigger. It's the event that kicks it off. Flow then can have any number of actions, and it can have additional logic, like conditions. Flows can have loops. They can have a do until loop. They can have a for each loop. They can also have different types of branches. You could have parallel branches. So you can build out your business process to do whatever type of workflow you're interested in. Your flows can then trigger other workflows if you want to isolate the business logic between different locations. To get started with a flow, we have literally thousands of templates available on the Flow website. These templates help users to get started by pre-configuring and bringing together actions and triggers in a way that they're already set up. So that way the average user doesn't have to worry too much about exactly how to wire things together if they're just coming and getting started out of the box. These templates are a great showcase to understand, if you're interested, what can Flow do? Well, the easiest way to find out is go to the website and browse our template gallery. There you can see thousands of different ways that users use Flow today to improve their business. Now, once you start using a template, you'll get a flow created, and then you can go to the Flow Designer. This is a little snippet here of what the Flow Designer looks like, and obviously I'll go into this more detail in the demo. But at the top of every flow is a trigger. The trigger is that event that starts it, and then below that are the actions. For the triggers and the actions, we have what we call inputs, which are those text boxes on those actions there. And you have to configure the inputs in order to make that particular action work. If you imagine send an email, obviously you need to say who you're sending the email to, what the subject of the email is, what the body is, etc. In terms of triggers, there are 3 different common types of triggers. The first one is you can run a flow manually based on a user taking an action. For example, we have a Flow mobile app that I'll show in a little bit that allows you to hit a button and immediately kick off a business process inside your organization. Another thing you can do is you can use Flow to run on a schedule. So you can say every week or every day at 4 a.m. This can even respond based on daylight savings time and those types of things. Finally, and this is the most common way that people run flows, is by running on response to an event that happens out in the cloud. So if I get an email or a file gets uploaded or somebody posts an RSS feed, all of these things can trigger flows. Then let's look at the actions. Actions can run any number of steps that you like, and they can connect both to cloud services and, of course, to data in the on-premise gateway like I mentioned. Actions can even connect to direct HTTP endpoints. That means if you've built a web API inside your organization and you want somebody to be able to build orchestration on top of this API, you want somebody to be able to build a process on top of that API, they can, simply by using the direct HTTP actions that we have inside of Microsoft Flow. Some actions in Flow don't even connect out to other data services. Sometimes you can use actions in Flow to transform data. If I want to take an array and I want to filter it down, or I want to store variables inside of a loop, or I want to convert something into an HTML table, I can do that using built-in actions that we have inside of Flow. Another important concept to understand is how data is passed from action to action inside of Flow. In order to get data to be used inside Flow, we have a concept called dynamic content. And really all that represents is the outputs of the previous actions and triggers inside of the flow. For example, let's say I have a trigger here that's uploading, when a file is uploaded to a particular place. That trigger has three outputs. It outputs the file name, the size of the file, and the actual file content. And each of these has a different type. If I then go and add an action onto the flow, and I have a field that takes any binary content as an input, I can use any of those trigger outputs in that action. So let's say this action is uploading a file to a particular folder. If I were to pass in the file name, I get a new file added to that folder that just has the file name as the contents. So that isn't exactly what I would want, but I can do that. Now, that action will in turn output additional data, such as the title and the title of the folder and how many items were in that folder. If I then add a third step, another action onto the flow, I can now use any of the data from both the trigger and the action above it. So inside a flow, you can continue to use any data that's from anywhere else above you inside the flow. The other important note here is that the data that we show is filtered based on the type of the field. This means that if I have data that's output as a number, and I have a number field that I would like to pass data into, I can only pass things like the size and the count, but I can't pass the title because that's a string, which doesn't match that type. So we do intelligent type matching there. And if you really know that that title is going to be a number by convention, you can explicitly cast types as well inside of Flow. OK, so I've been talking for enough time. Why don't I switch over to the demo? And of course, my computer has fallen asleep, so I'm going to need to sign in. There we go. So here I am at the Flow homepage. So you can just go here yourself by going to flow.microsoft.com and signing in. You can sign in with a Microsoft account or with an org ID. You don't need to just use your company's credentials. And when you come to the Flow website, we have a number of ways for you to very easily get started and learn about the capabilities of Microsoft Flow. At the top here, we have what we call featured template collections. And since this is Build, maybe you all would be interested in seeing the types of software development tasks that we can automate inside of an organization. For example, you can respond faster to customer bug requests. And here are a few templates that you see here that would help you with that. Or improve task management, or automate the follow-up on tasks. Each of these is a template, which means we have already configured for you the steps that need to run inside that flow and the data flow between each of those actions. So you could actually come to Flow right now and just start using these processes. In addition to using the templates, you can also browse the different connectors that we have inside of Flow. You can learn a bit about Flow and see some of the feature templates. And these templates have been used quite a bit. You can see this first template here has been used almost 250,000 times. So a lot of great scenarios are being built out today with Flow. We also have a mobile app that I'll talk about in a little bit. So now let's take a look at the different connectors that we have inside Flow. And with that, you can pull up and see, I can pull up in here and see at the top we have the recently added connectors. There's some custom connectors that have been built inside my organization. And then here's the full list of all the connectors. So don't try to memorize that list. But what I want to do for this demo is I want to build a simple flow that will create a Wunderlist task whenever a new bug is opened in Visual Studio and assigned to me. So I can go to Wunderlist and see the details of what Wunderlist can do inside of Microsoft Flow. And here are some triggers that Microsoft that Wunderlist has. So I can trigger when a new task is created, when a reminder is due, etc. But in this particular case, I want to find a template that creates a task for me when an item is assigned from Visual Studio. So when you create from a template inside Microsoft Flow, all you have to do is fill out the few required fields that you need to get this template to work. When I'm copying from Visual Studio into Wunderlist, I just need to tell it where to find the items in Visual Studio and where to put the item in Wunderlist. So I'm going to start with the account name that my Visual Studio, that I'm using inside Visual Studio Team Services, the specific project name. If I want, I can choose a specific team to put the item into, and I want to make sure that these items are assigned to me, and this is just an account I created for the build demo. So now I've configured this flow to listen to items created in this particular account, in this particular project and team. The only other thing I need to do is go to the Wunderlist list that I want to populate. So in this case, I'm just going to put these tasks into my inbox. And that's pretty much it. With just, say, 5 inputs here, I was able to create automation inside of my organization that enables me to now go to my Wunderlist list and see all the Visual Studio tasks that are created. But as I was talking about earlier, there's not a cliff here. It's not like that UI that I just showed you is the only way to manage that flow now. I can click on Edit Flow, and I can see the trigger, which is right here, as well as all of the actions that are inside that flow. So this is the full Flow UI designer that I was talking about. OK, so I've created this flow. Let's go ahead and test it out. So I'm going to perform the trigger action. So I'm going to actually go and create an item inside Visual Studio. So I'm going to switch over to that, and let's create a new bug. And just say, you know, it seems to be running a little slow. Whoops. Freudian slip there, maybe. And then I'll assign it to myself. And there we go. So now I've created the item inside Visual Studio. So you can see here, the flow picked up the fact that the Visual Studio item was created pretty quickly, almost instantaneously, in fact, and then created a task in Wunderlist. So if I switch over to Wunderlist, and if I sync my account, I should see, there we go, Visual Studio bug seems to be running slow. So in really just a couple minutes, I was able to create a process that listened to Visual Studio and automatically created a task. And you can imagine now, it doesn't have to be just a simple personal automation scenario. There's actually ways to take this and grow it up so that way a whole organization can take advantage of processes like this. So I will switch back to the PowerPoint. So let's talk about that. Let's go beyond just an individual creating a simple flow like I showed you that's useful for themselves to creating flows that are really about driving business processes inside an organization. So there are 3 different ways that we make flows available outside of just the context of an individual. The first is you can have a single flow that is owned and managed by multiple people at once. The most common way to do this is to say, hey, this security group should be the people that manage this particular flow. So that's about management of the flow. The second thing to talk about is buttons. Buttons are unique in that I can distribute flow buttons, which is, it's not a physical button, it's a software button, but I can distribute them throughout my organization, and then anybody can invoke those buttons. That means that I can create business processes like approval processes, like opening a bug, and make it possible for anybody to click the button, and all they have to see is the button and the inputs for it, and it goes and it runs without them having to worry about all the details and the innards of that flow. Finally, you can have people participate in the decision-making process of a flow by using what we call our modern approvals. Approvals allow people to be assigned tasks that they can then go and run inside the context of a flow. So starting with team ownership, I can say that I want a security group, an Office 365 modern group, or just a list of people to be able to manage a flow. In fact, we'd recommend that for any robust business process, you shouldn't have just one person own that, because if that person leaves the company, you want that process to continue running, right? Now, technically, if that happens, admins still have full control over the flow. So they could go to the admin center and they could assign it to somebody else, but you don't want to have to get the admin involved if you don't have to. Additionally, the connections that are in a flow don't have to be tied to just one person. The connections that a flow uses, so in that demo that I just showed you, that was my connection to Wunderlist and Visual Studio. Those connections could be tied, for example, to a service account. So that way, you can create a service account. As long as it's a named user in AED, you can then give it the right level of permissions and have it just control what you want it to control, and then you can use that connection inside of your flows. So that way, if somebody does leave the company, that flow continues to function. So team ownership is a very important concept. It helps people to create robust processes inside organizations. The second thing that I want to talk about is buttons. And buttons are particularly useful from when you're on a mobile device. Now, Flow has a lot of mobile capabilities. So you'll see in the next demo how you can use Flow mobile to run buttons and to start approval processes. But you also can even monitor flow activity and a wide variety of things. The Flow buttons can even be tied to physical devices. So we have partnerships with Flick and BTTN, if you've ever heard of those, that make these little tiny Wi-Fi and Bluetooth buttons you can distribute inside your organization. And when you hit those buttons, you can actually go and trigger a flow. Now, what I'm showing on screen here, this is a software button. This isn't a physical device, but it's a button nonetheless. So you can click, and you can have that go and run a flow. And these buttons can be distributed to your coworkers or to people inside your organization. So if I have a 6-day process that I would like everybody in my organization to use, I can create the 6-day button, and I can simply share it with everybody inside my department, and they can click that button and run it. You can also, of course, get links directly to buttons, so you can share them directly to people via that route as well. But buttons are really the best way to share the ability to run a business process inside of your org. One other thing about sharing buttons is sometimes, if you would like, you can have a button that's tied to the permissions of something other than a security group. For example, if I have a process that I want to kick off from a SharePoint list or a SharePoint document library, I can do that by creating a button that is tied to the permissions of that SharePoint list or that document library. So that way, everybody who has access to that SharePoint list will always be able to run that button. This is actually a relatively new feature that we've recently released. And we built this because people had this pain of keeping permissions in sync. They weren't sure if the people who had access to the right security group would have access to run the flow. And we solved that by allowing these buttons to be shared directly to a SharePoint list. Now, the third and final point that I want to mention in this section, approvals are the way that you can have processes that run across your business and have many different participants in the same process. If you think about HR, for example, HR request forms can span many different people. One of the most common, or not most common, but one of a scenarios that we have inside Microsoft is travel authorization. We often, at Microsoft, send people across the world, sometimes to less safe regions. And when you have an approval process that is established to make sure that you really have a true business need to go to a particular region of the world. And that's built on top of Microsoft Flow approvals. Of course, you have all of the things you'd expect, like contract approval, spec approval. All of these can go through the approval processes inside Microsoft Flow. And keep in mind, Flow is the successor to SharePoint Designer workflows, which means today, if you're out there and you're still using SharePoint Designer and using SharePoint workflows, now is the time to start thinking about how to get those processes into Microsoft Flow. Flow has the vast majority of capabilities that SharePoint Designer has today. There are still some gaps that we're working on closing within the next 6 months, but for the most part, everything that you can do in SharePoint Designer is there, and we'll close the remaining gaps soon. So if you have processes in your organization that use that, start looking at Flow today. Now, what does modern approvals inside Flow offer? Well, they give you the ability to view sent and received requests, the ability to do an approval on the go, right from your phone or your inbox. We have actionable message support inside of Outlook, so that way if you're in Outlook and you get an approval request with a single button tap, you can just respond, accept, or reject to that approval request. The approvals can be customized to meet your specific business needs. So if you want sequential approvals, I want one approval after another, or I want parallel approvals, I want 2 or 3 or 5 people to handle an approval process, you can do that by using the Flow Designer. And I'll show you a simple example of that right now. So to build this flow, rather than building from a template, what I'll do is I'll create from blank. Create from blank is how you can create any type of process that you would like. And when you do, you're first presented with some popular triggers that might help you get started, but what I want isn't in this list. So what I'll do for this flow is I'm going to create a button that I can share with my colleagues that will open a bug inside Visual Studio for my specific product or my specific team. When you're adding a trigger, you're first presented with a list of all of the different connectors that have triggers here. And this is just a small subset. In fact, here you can see, when I click See More, there's a huge number of connectors that we have available that can trigger flows. In this particular example, though, I just want to use the Flow button. So I'll select that, and that's been added. Now, the Flow buttons, I can add any inputs that I would like. And these inputs can have different types. I could have a file upload associated with the button. If I, for example, want somebody to take a picture with their phone and upload that file to send along with the flow. But for this example, I just need to add a text input. And for this, I'm going to say I want the bug title. Next, I'm going to add the actions into my flow. And I can do that by clicking New Step and adding an action. Searching for actions is just like searching for triggers in that I have a list of connectors as well as a list of actions down here. And you can see here the 327 actions that we have recommended. This isn't actually the full list because you see here there's 3 for Outlook. There's actually about 30 actions for Outlook. So we have probably at this point thousands of actions that you can use. And that's just the out-of-box ones. We also allow you to connect to any of your custom services as well. So really the possibilities are limitless with Microsoft Flow. But for this example, I would like to start an approval process. So I can see more here and select approvals. When I do that, there's just one action that the approval connector has, and that will get added on. Now, there are 2 basic types of approvals that we support. The first is anybody must approve on the approvers list, and the other one is everyone must approve. So you can think about the difference between that. One is much more robust than the other. One is, hey, I just need somebody to say this is OK. Another is, I need everybody to say this is OK. However, for the demo, I'm just going to be the only approver so I can get the demo done. So it doesn't really matter which one of those I choose. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to populate the title of the approval request. And when I do that, that dynamic content popover that I talked about earlier pops up. And you can see here the list of all of the outputs from the button trigger. So in this particular case, I want the title to match the bug title. In addition to using dynamic content, I can just type content directly into the Flow Designer, of course. And some fields are intelligent. So this one knows this field is an email field. So it automatically can do autocomplete. And since I'm the only approver, I don't need anybody else on this list. Next, I can add a condition into the flow. And the condition is how I get branching logic. When I do that, I get this if yes branch and if no branch. And inside the condition, I'm choosing what I want to check. In this case, I want to check to make sure that the approver, the response from the approver, is equal to approve. So that will make the flow go down the yes branch of the flow as long as I approve the request. So now on that branch, I can add the specific action that I want the flow to do. In this case, I would like to find a Visual Studio item to be added. So I search for Visual Studio, and it shows me all of the actions that Visual Studio has inside of Flow. And there are 11 here, 7 triggers, so a lot of things you can do with Visual Studio. But in this case, I just would like to create a work item. So when I create a work item, this UI may look familiar to you because it was similar to what I showed in the first demo. But I have to choose the account as well as the project that I'm interested in creating this bug in. And I can leave the work item type as a bug. And then finally, I would like to put the title into the work item. So when I do that, I can come down here and use the bug title output from the trigger. And notice how we're accumulating these outputs. So I can use outputs either from the step above it, which in this case is start an approval, or from the trigger. And as I add additional actions on, you'll see I can use any of the data as long as it matches the right type. So I just need to give this a name. Let's say, build demo, and hit save. And now this flow will be saved, and I can start showing you the mobile device. So this is the Flow mobile app here. And inside the Flow mobile app, on the first tab, we have activity, which just shows you what's been happening with your flows recently. So you can see here, I have flows like get Outlook tasks, create that task and note for assign Visual Studio item. That was a flow that I ran in the first demo. That was 13 minutes ago. So you can see all the flow activity here. But for this demo, I would like to click a button to start an approval. And the Buttons tab here gives me all of the buttons that I have created inside of my account. Well, another note about buttons, you can actually go and get the buttons right from the lock screen on your phone. So if I lock my phone here, you can see there's this Flow button section in the widget, and that build demo that I just created, I could actually click that right from here. But let's just do it from the app. So I'll go to the build demo, and I'll click that button. As soon as I do, if you remember, I had to provide the bug title. So I can say here, if I can spell properly, build bug, and hit done. As soon as I do that, it's going to start running the process. And you see, I immediately got that approval request. That's because I was the approver. Now, in real life, you'd almost certainly have different people submitting the bug as approving the bug, because what's the point if it's all one person? But just for demo purposes, I've done it all at once. And you can see, as soon as I clicked on that approval notification, I got a tailored UI here that showed me what I typed in the bug, just the bug title, who it came from. In this case, it was me again, what time. And then I can choose, do I want to approve or do I want to reject this incoming request? So I'm going to go ahead and approve it. Actually, no, I'm going to reject it because, no, I'll approve it. So I can approve it here, and I can add a comment if I want, and then hit confirm. As soon as I do that, it will go and create that item back inside Visual Studio. So I'll switch back to the desktop, and then see if that item actually got created. So I'll go back to the list of bugs. And you can see here, build bug just got created, and it's been successfully put into Visual Studio after I triaged it right from my phone very quickly. Now, from the flow here, I could customize or enhance this approval process as much as I wanted. So one of the other things that we support in Flow is, for example, adding parallel branches. So if I wanted 2 people to be handling this approval in parallel, I could do that here. You see, when I do that, I get the same UI that we've seen a few times already before, where I can add parallel actions in. So I can say, hey, I want to start a separate approval. I want to send this to somebody else. If I want, for example, to do an escalation path for approvals, I could do that by, after that second approval, I could get the manager of the person who approved the first request, and then I could add yet another approval action below that. So you can imagine here how you can really build out these approval flows to meet your business's needs. So now I'm going to start talking about some of the more advanced concepts that we have inside Microsoft Flow. So that was hopefully the easy part. Now let's talk about expressions. Expressions are the way to make advanced content inside of Microsoft Flow. So if you have, for example, a type that you want to convert, or you want to do an inline calculation, I just want to do some math. I want to divide 2 numbers, or add or subtract, or do something like that. I can do that. Or I can get the current time. One of the most powerful things you can do inside expressions is you can use the if conditional, which allows you to say, hey, if this value is equal to something, I want to select either A, or otherwise I want to select B. So it's just like if inside Excel. So our goal with the expression language was to make it similar in concept to what inside Excel formulas today. The actual language itself is a little different because it's based on Azure Logic Apps, but the concepts in many ways are similar. The big difference is that with Flow, our data types are based on JSON, which means if you've ever used JavaScript or an equivalent language, you already know exactly what type of data types we support today. So on the right-hand side there, if we're talking about the non-textual data types, we have floating point numbers, Booleans, we have arrays and objects. Those behave exactly like the JSON types that you're familiar with. We even support XML content inside Microsoft Flow. So if you do have a legacy API that returns back to XML, you can actually parse that and convert that into JSON or run an XPath on it. In addition to the non-textual types, we also have a variety of different encodings that we support for strings. So if you have an API that returns back a base64 object or returns back something that's been URI encoded, you can actually parse and handle that inside of Flow as well. Finally, whenever we use strings inside Flow, inside expressions, and you'll see this in a second, you need to use single quotes to wrap that string. So it's a little different from other languages where oftentimes it's double quotes, but it's something that's important for a reason I'll mention in the future. So one final note here, because of data types, the string true does not equal the token true. So make sure that you're putting the proper data types in when you're constructing strings directly. So how to create expressions. So you saw me click the Add Dynamic Content button. And when I did that, I got a dialog that popped up that had Dynamic Content tab. There's a second tab there called Expression that I can click, and I can fill in an expression there. As soon as I do that, then I can hit OK, and I get an expression placeholder placed directly into the action. So let's break apart what exactly that expression looks like. So let's say for this example, I have an object that I have output from a previous step, and it has 3 properties, ID, title, and name. And what I want to do is I want to take the title, and I want to replace that placeholder, which is bracket time, with the actual current timestamp. So to do that, I will use the string replace function. First, you type the expression, and you have to understand how many parameters that expression has. For replace, there are 3 parameters. The first parameter is the string that you're passing in. The second parameter is the string you're searching for in it. And the third parameter is the string you're going to go and replace it with. Once you know what the parameters are, you can start filling those in. So for the search string, I want to just type in bracket time. And I'll use single quotes there because that's a literal. That's an actual string that I'm just going to search for. Next, you can use other expressions inside of this expression. So on the right-hand side there, I'm going to call the UTC-now function that gets the current timestamp. On the left, I'm going to get the body from the record step that actually output those 3 properties. And finally, you can dereference into JSON objects as far as you would like. So in this case, I have a title property from that. So I'm going to use the square bracket syntax. You can also use the JSON dot syntax to get at these particular properties. So with these few steps, I was able to construct an expression that replaces content with the current timestamp. Now, one of the things that is important to work with in expressions as well is arrays. And unfortunately, inside Flow, arrays are probably one of the most difficult things to work with. And the reason is there's a bunch of different ways that you may want to use an array. So first of all, arrays can be composed of many different things. I could have an array of strings or of numbers or of objects. And if you have an array of objects, and I want to pass that to another action, the schema of the object may not even match with between the source and the destination. So sometimes you have to transform arrays inside of Flow. You can use expressions as well as actions to do that. You can also use expressions to just get a specific item from a list. So if I want to get the first item from the list or the last item from the list, I can use an expression to do that. Likewise, you can filter a list down. If I want to take the set of items and reduce it, you can do that as well. So expressions are a great way to deal with arrays, but definitely if you're going to be doing some advanced array handling, I recommend reading up on our documentation on the different ways that you can do that. Another advanced concept I'd like to talk about briefly is how to handle errors. So normally when a flow runs, it runs in sequence, which means it runs the first step and the second step, et cetera. And if any of the steps fail, all the subsequent actions are skipped. That means that a single failure in a flow, if you don't handle it properly, can result in your entire business process being terminated. So what we've done to prevent that from being a problem, though, is by creating error handling actions. So you can add an action anywhere in your flow, in the beginning and the end, wherever you'd like, that can run after a previous action has failed or has been skipped because an action above it, for example, failed. This allows you to create more robust processes by sending yourself a notification or by undoing a previous action or really whatever you imagine inside of your flow. So now I'll switch over to my next demo. And for this demo, I'm just going to modify the flow that I created from the first one. And what I'd like to do, today when I created this flow, I created as a button that I could trigger. But I think it would be more interesting if I could have all the people in the audience trigger this button to be able to open bugs for us. So what I'm going to do is I'm first going to just remove those outputs from the trigger so I can change it. I'm going to change this from a button trigger to an email trigger. So I've set up an inbox that I can actually use to get ideas be submitted from you all in the audience. And it's just in a particular folder that I have here, flow contact. So now this flow, rather than listening to a button, now listens to a new email arriving. And that email can come from anybody. Next, I can update the approval action to use, say, the subject of the message as the title of the bug. Another thing I want to do is I want to create a live Power BI dashboard that shows me how this flow is executing. So I can do that by pushing data to a streaming data set inside of Power BI. So I can search for Power BI here. You can see we have an add rows to data set action inside of that flow. And then I choose what Power BI workspace. In this case, it's the flow contact workspace, as well as the data set that I created for this and what table I would like to stream data into. And when I do this, you may notice that we've gone to that particular data set and gotten the columns from that data set. Each data set may have a distinct set of fields, but in this case, it has these particular fields here that I created for this demo. So for the name of the person, I can pass that in. For the idea, I said that's going to come in the subject of the email. Status will start out as pending. And for the date, that's when the email was received. So that I have added at the beginning of the flow. The other thing that I need to do is add an action at the end of the flow to push to the Power BI data streaming set when the approval has been completed. So I'll add another row to the data set, and I'll pick the same workspace that I created before, and the same data set, and the same table. And likewise, I'm not going to change the name, so I can come over here. You can also search inside of dynamic content. So I wanted to search for the from. So when you have a lot of outputs like I do now, you see there's all of these outputs from all these previous actions. It's oftentimes much faster just to search. So I can do a subject. And for the status, I am now going to pass in the status from the approval action. So I can go and hit the response. And now I'm going to use an expression. So I've been using this dynamic content tab extensively, but I can come over to the expression tab, and it gives me a list of all of the different options that I have for filling in an expression. So for the date function, I want to get the current timestamp. So if I come down here, I can see there's a function called UTC now that I can call. I can see what other options I have. There's a lot of them, actually. We have over 100 different functions you can call. But I'm just going to use UTC now and hit OK. So now that that's been added, the last thing I want to do is track the duration of how long it took me to approve this request. So I can do that by writing a more advanced expression. So this expression, what I'm going to do is I'm going to subtract 2 date times. So I'm going to type sub. As you notice, as I'm building this out, we also have IntelliSense that shows you the parameters of the expression as you go. So I'm going to subtract, well, I want to subtract from the current timestamp. And the other thing I need to do is I need to convert the time to ticks so that way I can do that math. Because you can't subtract 2 strings, obviously. So I'm taking the ticks of UTC now, and then the other thing I'm going to do is take the ticks of the receive time of the email. Now, in this popover, I can also switch back to the dynamic content tab and find that received time that I had, and it will automatically drop in the expression for that particular output. So you see here, the receive time is actually a property inside the JSON object. So I can scroll over there. Whoops. So it looks like I lost the outputs there, but I can rebuild it real quick. Ticks. Okay, so now if I save this flow, it looks like I have an invalid parameter somewhere, so let's take a look and see exactly where that is. Oh, I had removed the subject from here, so I'll put that back. And yeah, you're right, it looks like it did. I misclicked again, so I'll try one more time, and then if this doesn't work, I'll switch to my backup flow. Let's see now. Dynamic content. Nope, killed it again. Okay, so I will switch to my backup flow now. Not that that ever happens in demos. And we can see that I built but 1 hour ago. And we can see the expression that I put there. So you can see this is what it is. And oftentimes, you can always just click on this to edit it again when everything is working exactly as it's supposed to be. So what I'm going to do now is I'll turn on this flow. And if you would like, you can send an email to flowcontact@service.microsoft.com. And it will start kicking off this approval process. So I can type it on the screen if I can type properly. flowcontact@service.microsoft.com. So if you go there, if you send that email, it'll start kicking off an approval process. And I've created this Power BI dashboard here that takes that data as you go. So you see here, it's pre-populated with some of the ideas that I already had put in, but you see somebody put in, get the slide deck for this session, and as people submit more ideas, this will start going. So now what I can do is I can triage these ideas by going to the Approvals tab. So that request about getting the slide deck for this session, that should actually show up here. So you can see somebody submitted this. So I can approve this because I believe all the sessions are streamed and fully recorded, so I can say great idea. And hit confirm. And if I go back to the Power BI report now, because I pushed that second event, it will actually, you see the approval pie grew a little bit more. The latency for doing the approval, for that request was at 0.71 minutes. And you can see there's more requests coming in. And yes, we did encounter a bug with the expression builder, so we'll work on that. So that is how you can build a flow that uses a lot of different capabilities inside Power BI. And the other thing that I wanted to show inside that flow is how to do an error handling action. So I can show that at the end of the flow. So we'll come back and we'll go and add a new step at the end. So for this error handling action, I'm going to send a notification. I was going to send myself a notification saying, hey, the flow has failed. And when I do that, I can go up to this ... menu, and up here, there's a bunch of different settings for actions. So you can configure, decompression and the timeout of the action, the retry policy. The other thing you could do is you can configure the run after. So this is how you can make an action that runs only after the previous action has failed or was skipped. And when you do that, you may notice that the designer, it highlights that arrow red to indicate that this particular branch will only run if any of the previous actions fail. So that was building out a flow that uses expressions. So for the final section, I'm going to talk a little bit about how you can take those flows and grow them up into logic apps. So with the flows today, you can already call logic apps directly if you'd like. So because Flow supports calling any arbitrary HTTP endpoint, in the flows, you can make that HTTP call, and you can actually have a flow or a logic app that has a trigger called request. And that request trigger allows you to receive an HTTP call. And it's a little hard to see on the slide, but in that gray box, there's a URL that you can actually copy and paste and use. And then you can use that to isolate logic. You can have a pro developer go and build some key logic inside a logic app, and you can call it from a flow. You can even have flows call other flows via this mechanism. Likewise, if I really want to take a flow and I want to convert that to a logic app, I can do that by exporting the flow as a logic app resource definition template. So whenever you go to a flow, in that More menu, there's two ways you can, in fact, export flows. One is by exporting as a package that you can use to move your flows across environments. So that's useful if you have, say, a dev environment and a prod environment, and you want to build your flows in your dev environment, test them out, make sure they work and don't encounter errors like I did. And then when you go to production, you can export it and bring that whole package over. But for logic apps, you get a simple resource definition file. And with that file, when you bring it into the Azure portal, you then have to repair the connections for that particular logic app, because connections that live inside of Flow are tied to a particular owner or individual in that environment, whereas the connections that live inside Azure are stored in the resource group. So you do have to use a new set of connections when you bring that flow over as a logic app. Now, some other things to keep in mind is there are some limitations for going from Flow to Azure. For example, not all connectors are available inside logic apps. Specifically, the connectors that rely on the Flow mobile app are not available. So that Flow button, the Flow approvals, and the notifications are not available inside Azure logic apps today. So if you're building the process like the last one I showed you, that you have to use Flow for. But besides that, you can really bring any other capabilities over to logic apps that you want. Finally, as I mentioned, you can actually call logic apps from Flow as a HTTP endpoint or as a custom connector. Now, custom connectors has a whole dedicated session tomorrow. So if you're interested about how you can build connectors in your organization or allow other people to call your ISV application if you have one, you can do that by building a custom connector. So I strongly recommend checking out that session if you find it interesting. Another thing you can do is you can embed Flow into websites. So this is a screenshot of me just doing it with Wunderlist. But you can actually take an iframe of many different types of Flow views and put them into an application. So if you have your application and you want to create your own set of templates and capabilities with Flow, you can actually do that. And there's more documentation at that URL. And since the slides will be posted, you could come to that URL later if you'd like. So for my last demo, I'm going to just show real quick how you can take a flow and export it as a logic app and what that looks like. So I'll go back to my list of my flows, and I'll take, say, a simple flow like this flow, and I go to this menu here, and I can hit export, and I can export it as a logic apps package, and I'll just save this. Now when I go to the Azure portal, I can create a resource from a template by searching for template in the marketplace. So I'll select a template deployment. And because I downloaded that file, I can actually just upload it directly into the template editor here. I don't have to copy paste, so I can hit load file and select that flow that I exported and hit save. And then I can give it a specific resource group name. I have to give my logic app a name. And it will automatically create those connections for me. I, of course, agree to the terms of conditions, blah, blah, blah. And it will go and start creating this, this logic app from that definition that I downloaded. So this can take a few seconds, so I can click on this to see the progress. So you can see it's deployed the first connection. And there we go. So it completed in 10, 15 seconds there. And I can open up that logic app. And when I do, notice that the logic app is disabled by default. And that's because the connections aren't yet configured. So before I can actually make this logic app work, I have to select Edit and open up the Logic Apps Designer. And when I do that, you notice it gives me those little warnings to indicate that, indeed, I have to repair this connection. So if single sign-on is working properly, I click the sign-in link there and just grant it access. This creates a connection in this particular Logic Apps resource group. And do the same thing for Wunderlist. That will take a moment as well. And then I can hit save. And now my logic app is ready to go. I can enable this logic app, and now it will run instead of the flow inside of the flow portal that I created. And if I edit this, you can even go back and see the full code view for this logic app. So you can take this definition, you can check this into source control, you can do whatever you'd like with it as a ProDev capability from the Azure portal. So just before we close, I'll leave a few minutes for Q&A, and I'll stick around afterwards as well. I want to talk about a few more things. First, how is Microsoft Flow available? You can get it as part of your Office 365 or Dynamics 365 subscriptions. So we include, for example, 2,000 runs per month with Office 365. Second, if you don't currently have Office 365 or Dynamics 365, you can actually purchase Flow P1 for $5 a month or Flow P2 for $15 a month, and they come with additional runs and additional features as well. We have a public roadmap, which is available here. I won't read through all of the bullet points on this slide, but some of the interesting points are, one, we're continuing to improve the user experience to provide better guidance for debugging flows, for example, when they do fail. And a little further out than Q3, we'll have a rich HTML text editor, for example. We're also doubling down on Office 365 integration, so that way you can use Flow better from inside of SharePoint and from inside of Exchange. And we have more compliance capabilities coming. GDPR, I'm sure all of you have heard about GDPR and that coming soon. So we're fully GDPR compliant now. And we will bring in more data residency in the coming months. So definitely check out our roadmap offline if you get a chance. And we have a number of other sessions coming up. So if you're interested in learning about custom connectors, check that out. If you're interested in learning about how to embed Flow in your own applications, we have an ISV session coming up as well. So definitely check that out. And you can get started. So with that, I'm going to open it up to Q&A. So if you wouldn't mind coming up to the mic so that way people on the webcast can hear you, that would be great. Or if you don't have any questions, we can end early.
One question for your Microsoft Flow, compared to existing, you mentioned earlier about SharePoint on-premise, SharePoint Designer workflow. What's the gap? Is that you said Flow will be the successor to SharePoint workflow? Could you explain more on that,
yeah,
especially on-premise?
Yeah, so specifically, there are a set of actions in the SharePoint connector that are not yet available for Flow. And those specifically revolve around a few areas. One is site administration, like the ability to create and manage SharePoint sites. Another is doc set management. So if you're using those capabilities inside SharePoint workflow, we don't have native actions to do those today. However, as I've mentioned a few times, because you can use any web API, any HTTP endpoint, you can still accomplish that from inside Flow. You just don't get the nice kind of UI designer that I showed there. You have to kind of put the JSON object for making that API call directly. So you can still do everything you can do in SharePoint Designer, but we're closing the gaps in terms of the action sets in the coming months.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Hey, just kind of a general question on that stuff on the flows there. You mentioned timeouts on there. Is it possible that a timeout can be infinite on a flow? And I guess is there an overall lifetime on a flow? Like it's going to be killed after a certain period of time, or?
So flows last for up to 30 days today.
Okay.
So and that means any individual action also can't last more than 30 days.
Okay.
So like an approval action, if I don't respond within 30 days, the flow will be canceled. However, I can create a timeout, for example, that's like starts a new flow if you really
29
want to.
days. If it's still at that state, you start the new flow. The other question around the error handling actions, you'd said at the end like if an action times out or skips. So by putting that at the end, was that just effectively a global error handler for the entire thing?
That's exactly right. Yep.
That's what I thought.
Hey there. Nice
Hi.
session, by the way.
Thank you.
So kind of going on the question of how Flow is starting to replace workflows in SharePoint, thinking about things like in Dynamics and all that has their own workflows.
Yep.
Is that kind of what you see Flow becoming eventually as well, or?
Absolutely. So the goal ultimately will be that Microsoft just has Microsoft Flow. We shouldn't need a separate workflow engine for Dynamics and for SharePoint and for all of the various other applications that we have. The number of gaps we have with Dynamics is a bit bigger than we have with SharePoint today. So I can't tell you, hey, get rid of your Dynamics workflows and go build on Flow. But at this point, if you do have solutions that are asynchronous in nature, and you do want the ability to connect out to other services, Flow is actually a better choice than Dynamics Workflow for those types of things. If you're doing things that are inside about data integrity, for example, that run transactionally with your data set inside Dynamics 365, then continuing to use the Dynamics 365 workflow right now is absolutely the right choice.
Cool. Thank you.
Yep.
For the on-premise, will Flow be supported for SharePoint on-premise?
So Flow will probably forever run only in the cloud, but you can use the on-premise data gateway to connect to SharePoint data that is on premises. So although the workflow will execute scalably inside the cloud, your data can be entirely on premises if you want. So as long as you're okay with that, then you can use Flow today for any SharePoint on-prem scenarios. Any other questions? Okay.
So our IT department is going to build flows
Yep.
for a lot of people, and so we're concerned about, we don't want an individual user or group of users to own that, because if they leave, right?
Yep.
Is it a good practice to have a service account to basically own those workflows?
Yes. So I would say in terms of ownership of the workflow itself, a security group should be fine. So make sure that the IT dev team has access to the security group, and the security group owns the flow. For specific connections inside the flow, that's where a service account comes in. And then you can grant that particular service account just the permissions for whatever resource you need to connect to. So that way you can limit the blast radius if something goes wrong with it.
Hi, so I'm going to ask two questions.
Okay.
The first just ties on to what you had just answered about on-premise. If we have Flow reach back onto on-premise, is there something we can install on-premise so that it will update or call a flow when a record is created, for example, in our on-premise SharePoint or on-premise Dynamics 365?
Yes. So for on-premise SharePoint, you can trigger flows as well.
Sure. And is there something we have to install to do that, or does it just...
Yeah, so it's the on-premises data gateway.
Okay.
So it's the same data gateway that Power BI uses as well. So, like I was showing, there's that common layer between Power Apps, Power BI, and Flow. It all uses the same underlying technology.
Cool. And the second question is sort of similar, which is it possible, you said you can call a logic app from Flow. Can you do the reverse and call flows from logic apps?
You could. So if you create the trigger as the request, HTTP request trigger, which is the endpoint, you can call that from anything. So you could call it from a logic app if you want as well.
Just one more. Because now Microsoft mentioned that Flow is going to replace, replacement, the successor for SharePoint Designer Workflow. When do we can anticipate Microsoft saying that for the Dynamics 365 workflow?
I can't give a specific timeline. I would say at this point, we are saying publicly that in the fullness of time, all of the capabilities that you can do inside Dynamics Workflow will be inside Microsoft Flow, but that is not the case today. So if you're building a solution today, you do have to kind of make that choice between, hey, am I doing something transactionally inside the data, or am I doing something that's kind of a connective asynchronous business process? So depending on which one you have to choose today, but eventually they will all combine under one technology stack. Cool. Well, I'll stick around if you want to talk one-on-one or you have any other questions, feel free to stop by. Thanks a lot for spending time with me today.